In class, we had discussed the Egyptian belief in the afterlife as being a continuation of this life. And we had seen, for example, the boat that ferries the soul across the Nile to the west, to the land of the dead, and this funerary stele, this gravestone that shows the continuation of life with various tasty treats, and the entire family with Tembu and his wife enjoying this afterlife. And the whole point of both mummification and the statues was that the soul, would have a place to live eternally. And for this reason, they appear to us as eternally fit, eternally young, especially for the aristocrats, so that they would in fact live together or live forever. In addition to the statues and the mummy, there was also the idea of the mastaba, which was the Egyptian word for eternal house, a house for the afterlife. They looked from the outside just like normal houses that one would live in during the earthly life, but they're solid inside and simply mask a shaft that leads to a chamber underground. These were made of mud brick on the banks of the Nile, on the western banks of the Nile, and the body was placed in this chamber underneath. These mud brick buildings were originally decorated with wood panels that were painted, like this one, which we talked about in class when we discussed proportions of Egyptian figures. And then around 2600 BC, the pharaohs, the kings of this region, began to replace the mud mastabas with stone pyramids. And your text tells you that this was the very first of them. The mastabas didn't simply disappear at that point, but continued to be used by nobles. However, for a period, the pharaohs were being buried in gigantic pyramids. Now, like I said, the text says this is the first of these stone pyramids, and in fact, it originally began as simply a mastaba. We've done technical research to find out what's underneath the stepped pyramid, and you can see that it was a mastaba that was enlarged once, twice, and then built up 2 different times to get to the structure that we see today. With these subsequent enlargements, it's kind of a nice metaphor. It looks like a giant staircase leading us to heaven, and that may be part of the motivation behind the design. It was originally faced in a smooth stone, polished stone, just like the later pyramids were. This idea of a staircase to heaven certainly can be related to Egyptian religion. The pharaohs believed that they joined the sun god Ra after death and became stars in the sky, just as Ra is the sun. Ra was believed in Egyptian religion during the day to, of course, live in the heavens. Then at night he went and met Osiris, the god of the underworld, every night when the sun set. And this meeting with Osiris rejuvenated Ra, and he rose again in the morning in the east. This is because Osiris was the god of resurrection. He had been killed by his brother, whose name was Seth, and was torn to pieces. He was then reassembled. The pieces were put back together by Isis and Nephthys, and he then became the god of rebirth, the god of vegetation. And so if we think about this part of Egyptian religion, realizing that Ra goes to meet Osiris as it goes down in the west, the dead basically follow him. They are shuttled across the Nile toward the sunset to the west bank of the Nile, where they would be buried. There they too would join Osiris, become resurrected, and live forever. Many have suggested a connection between the pyramids of Egypt and the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, which were begun earlier, around 3000 BC. Even though this is a later example because it's better preserved, we do see this interchange of cultures, ideas going back and forth between the two. And this is not the only kind. but it's been adapted, and that's a very important element. The ziggurat was a temple in the center of the city where the people lived. The pyramid was, in fact, for burial. It was simply a tomb. But that said, it was also part of a larger complex of funerary buildings that were meant to replicate his earthly court. So here's a computer schematic of the step pyramid in the middle, surrounded by two different courts, one in the north, one in the south, and various other buildings that replicated the court that Zoser lived in while he was alive. In other words, he had everything he needed to survive forever. He had statuettes of servants, he had mock versions of furniture, he had sustenance in the wall decorations like what we saw in class. He had everything he needed to survive. This was his permanent court, built entirely of stone. The pyramids soon evolved into simpler, smooth-sided forms, and again they were faced with polished limestone, of which only part of one is there, and it's fairly badly worn. The rest was stolen, used for other purposes. We're not sure when or by whom. Again, these are probably symbolic for the ascent of the pharaoh to join Ra in the sky. The three major pyramids you see here were built by three successive pharaohs, a father who built the largest one, his son, slightly smaller, and the grandson here. We looked at this in class very briefly. Here we're going to focus on the largest of the three. The first one of the smooth-sided pyramids that was built by the pharaoh Khufu. And here we see a close-up of it on your left. Just like Zoser's pyramid, it was part of a larger complex. So here's Khufu's pyramid here, and you can see, in fact, pyramids for his primary wives. He actually had four. One's been destroyed, these smaller pyramids, so three of them remain. We have mastabas for family and court members. There's a long causeway, just as there is for each of the pyramids, that runs from the funerary temple here, right at the base of the pyramid, all the way to the side of the Nile, where the valley temple was, the last of the rituals before walking up the causeway to the pyramid. It's important to keep scale in mind. This causeway was almost a third of a mile, and it was covered, and then all the way down to the Nile. The pyramid itself is actually colossal in size. There's over 2 million stones, each of which were cut, and average about 2.5 tons each. That's the weight of a very large pickup truck. The largest of these is 15 tons. The pyramid is 455 feet on the side. Tall, 455 feet tall, and 755 feet on the side. We assume it took around 25 years to complete, and in order to work at that pace, they set a stone every 2 minutes, which is a pretty incredible feat of engineering. We no longer think it was done by slave labor. Workers' camps were found nearby, so we're thinking this was the work of skilled laborers. They remained, however, the tallest man-made structure all the way until the Gothic Cathedral of the Middle Ages. It's also incredibly accurate. The base is horizontal to within 1/2 of an inch. The sides face the cardinal points of the compass, and that should be no big surprise given their interest in the sun. And they are within 2.5 inches of the same length, over 755 feet. The entrance, you see it here, is 56 feet up the northern side, and 24 feet off center. It opens into a 3-foot passage that leads down through the pyramid and into the live rock below. It levels out at an underground chamber here. This is very similar to the old mastaba burials, and was probably intended either as the original burial site or as a ruse to fool thieves looking for valuable objects that were buried with the pharaoh. So it's one of these two things. Either they changed their mind or they put it there because that had been the tradition, and people would get there and think it was already looted and just go home. At a certain point, before we get to the live rock of the Earth, it bends and goes upward at exactly the same angle as it was descending. Second passage leading upward. Khufu may have changed his mind, but this idea of a passage leading up inside the pyramid is very different from what Djoser had done, where everything was down below the pyramid, just like with the mastodon. Same height, same angle, leading upward toward this area where it gets taller, called the Grand Gallery. So 28 feet tall, 7 feet wide. At the bottom, it cants inward at about the 7-foot level. And so as the stairs move up through the Grand Gallery, it gets narrower and narrower and narrower. Here at the start of the Grand Gallery, there is a passage that leads off horizontally to what's called the Queen's Chamber. A large peaked roofed area, about 17 by 19 feet. There was a niche in the end for a statue of the Queen, 20 feet tall at the apex here. It sits exactly halfway between the north and south faces. But east-west is off by about 17 feet. These are all things that are points of discussion amongst Egyptologists. Going back into the Grand Gallery, we see we can work our way up. There's people to give you a sense of scale as we're scaling through. And you'll notice the stairs get closer and closer to the ceiling as we get closer and closer to the top. As we get to the very top, what we find is a step 3 feet tall that blocks the way. And after you climb over that through a very narrow passageway, here only 3.5 feet tall, we get to what's called the King's Chamber. 18 by 34 feet wide, flat roof this time, 20 feet tall and faced with granite. The roof itself is 9 independent stones weighing a total of 400 tons. And you'll see here that there are relieving spaces underneath it so that they don't buckle under the weight of the pyramid on top. These 5 empty chambers reflect the weight around the outside. So this is where the pharaoh Khufu would eventually have been buried. His wife, we think, beneath him, or maybe that was also just a change in plan. But from the King's Chamber, from the very top here, there are 2 air shafts that lead out from the chamber to the face of the pyramid. Some have suggested that they align with the stars and the sun, but one of them isn't exactly straight. So they may have just been there to help get air into where the workers are burying. And it remains a point of much debate as to exactly what they were used for. That's it for this art section. I'm sorry, that's a few minutes long.